Ah, the French Revolution, where liberty, equality, and fraternity often ended up tangled in the bedsheets. Forget storming the Bastille. Half of Paris was storming each other's bedrooms. But before we dive into this scandalous saga, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button like a guillotine blade coming down, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and at what ungodly hour? Midnight, breakfast, or somewhere in between? Ah, the French Revolution. Bread was scarce, heads were rolling, and apparently everyone still had the time to invent some of the weirdest bedroom hobbies Europe had ever seen. You'd think when half the nobility was dodging guillotines, people would have more pressing concerns than who was kissing whom behind a barricade. But no, Paris decided that liberty, equality, and fraternity should also apply to your sex life. Let's start with the salons. Officially, they were places to discuss Rousseau, Voltaire, and the rights of man. Unofficially, they were Tinder with powdered wigs. Behind all that lofty talk of democracy, candles burned low, corsets came loose, and suddenly political debates turned into very physical experiments. Imagine storming the Bastille during the day and then storming someone's boudoir by night. It was practically a double shift. And then there were the masquerade balls. Everyone knew what was going on, but the anonymity of masks gave Parisians a plausible deniability shield. Robes, wigs, and silk disguises meant you could flirt with your enemy, kiss your neighbor, and no one would know until they guessed your perfume. One pamphlet even complained that citizens were more interested in unmasking bodies than tyrants. Brutal, but accurate. The scandals didn't stop there. Revolutionary clubs, which were supposed to debate constitutions, started doubling as underground swinger parties. Jacobins were terrifying in daylight, bloodthirsty, fanatical, yelling about traitors. But by candlelight, they became poets of passion, experimenting with positions and kinks that even the Romans would have blushed at. A British spy even reported that one such meeting ended with every sense inflamed, every principle forgotten, and every chair overturned. Now that's what you call furniture reform. Even convents and monasteries weren't immune. With religion under siege, nuns and monks suddenly found themselves, well, liberated. And by liberated, I don't mean politically. I mean throwing out vows faster than Louis XVI lost his crown. There are whispered stories of confiscated church wine fueling clandestine liaisons in candlelit chapels, Holy Communion with a very different interpretation. And of course, what would Paris be without pamphlets? Revolutionary gossip spread faster than guillotines dropped. Every week, someone printed a lurid little booklet accusing some noble or general of bizarre sexual conduct, orgies with servants, role play as executioners, even aristocrats dressing as peasants just to get a thrill. If Twitter had existed in 1793, half of Paris would have been canceled within an hour. Society didn't just whisper about these scandals, they devoured them. Ordinary Parisians might not have had bread, but they sure had stories, wild, ridiculous, and deliciously shameful. And while the revolution was about tearing down thrones, behind closed doors, people were busy tearing off something else entirely. So yes, the French Revolution gave the world liberty, equality, fraternity, but also an erotic underground that historians politely call private experiments and gossip columns called pure degeneracy. Honestly, it's hard to tell which legacy Paris enjoyed more. Now, if you thought things couldn't get spicier than salons turned Tinder, let me introduce you to the pamphlet wars. Because during the Revolution, if people weren't writing new constitutions, they were busy writing smut. And not just discreet poetry, oh no, this was full-blown, explicit political fan fiction. Every noble, general, and queen was suddenly the star of a lurid bedroom exposé. Take Marie Antoinette. Long before her head hit the basket, her reputation was already shredded by pamphlets describing her supposed appetites. From affairs with guards to scandalous trysts with ladies of her court, she was painted as France's #1 dominatrix.
though in reality, she was probably just trying not to cry over stale bread. Still, the gossip worked. By 1791, she wasn't a queen anymore, she was a walking tabloid headline. Imagine TMZ without cameras, just a million quills dipped in ink. And then came the aristocrats in disguise kink. Picture this: nobles sneaking into taverns dressed as peasants, pretending they were ordinary citizens to seduce commoners. Forget cosplay conventions. This was revolutionary LARPing with a very adult twist. Of course, some nobles got caught, and nothing killed the mood faster than realizing your one-night stand was actually a duke with an execution date. Meanwhile, in Parisian brothels, the revolution meant business was booming. Soldiers fresh from the barricades, politicians drunk on rhetoric, and aristocrats desperate for one last night of fun before the guillotine, all crowded into dimly lit rooms decorated with velvet and desperation. These weren't just encounters, they were theater. Some brothels staged mock trials, where clients role-played as judges, prisoners, or even guillotine victims. Yes, they literally turned executions into foreplay. Freud would have needed 2 lifetimes to unpack that. But my personal favorite? The invention of the citizen orgy. See, in a world obsessed with equality, some bright minds decided that meant everyone should participate. No titles, no ranks, just pure, unfiltered chaos. Pamphlets describe rooms where men and women of every class tossed away their wigs, their silks, and their social standing all in one sweaty pile. Revolutionary idealists claimed these gatherings symbolized the death of hierarchy. I'd say it was more like the birth of mass awkwardness. And of course, let's not forget the spies. Yes, European courts were paying people to infiltrate Paris, not just to track politics, but to report on these scandals. Letters back to London and Vienna didn't just mention guillotines. They dripped with stories of masked orgies, libertine clubs, and generals caught in compromising positions. Imagine being paid a royal salary just to write, "Dear Majesty, today I witnessed a Jacobin undress with revolutionary enthusiasm." But here's the kicker. The revolution wasn't just about sex. It was about turning sex into propaganda. Every rumor about a noble's kink, every story about a priest's secret indulgence was weaponized. Lust became politics, and politics became the dirtiest bedroom game of all. So yes, while Paris burned with revolution, it also smoldered with scandal. Bread lines in the street, orgies in the salons, and pamphlets making 50 Shades look like a children's bedtime story. Only in France could political upheaval and sexual liberation march hand in hand, sometimes literally. Now, if you thought the pamphlets and brothels were wild, let me introduce you to the clubs. And no, not the kind with cocktails and EDM. I'm talking about secret societies where politics and passion collided in candlelit rooms that smelled like wax, sweat, and cheap wine. The Jacobin Club, for example, wasn't just about speeches and guillotines. Rumors swirled that certain after-meetings devolved into drunken, half-dressed debates where men argued about the Constitution while flirting with their opponents' mistresses. Picture C-SPAN, but everyone's pants are missing. These gatherings blurred the line between politics and pleasure until no one remembered if they were voting on a new law or on who got the next kiss. And don't even get me started on the clergy. While priests were officially stripped of power, many of them found new roles as bedroom confessionals. Yes, ex-priests set up clandestine confessionals where you could pay to confess sins that became a whole lot steamier in retelling. Some even offered absolution through indulgence, a euphemism so shameless it makes OnlyFans look like Sunday school. Meanwhile, aristocrats awaiting execution developed a strange obsession: deathbed desires. With the guillotine looming, some nobles treated their last nights alive like bachelor parties on steroids. Eyewitnesses wrote of condemned dukes arranging elaborate feasts complete with musicians, masked courtesans, and enough champagne to drown their sorrows, literally. These weren't ordinary parties, they were the ultimate last hurrah, where the soundtrack of flirtation mingled with the drum beats of the revolution. And let's not skip the women of Paris, because trust me, they weren't just passive bystanders. Revolutionary women's clubs doubled as matchmaking hubs, where fiery debates often ended with passionate rendezvous. Some radical pamphlets even celebrated women taking lovers openly, framing it as their right to freedom of choice. Tinder bios had nothing on these manifestos. Imagine scrolling through one that reads, "Guillotine enthusiast, bread shortage survivor, seeking partner for equality, and occasional mischief." And then there were the masquerades, lavish masked balls where nobles and revolutionaries alike indulged in their fantasies. The anonymity of a mask meant a duchess could dance with a butcher, or a Jacobin firebrand could flirt with the wife of an aristocrat he voted to condemn. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and almost poetic, because under the mask, everyone was equal, at least until the unmasking, when reputations could shatter like fine glass. But the real irony, for all its chaos, the revolution created a stage where intimacy became another kind of rebellion. To sleep with whom you pleased, to discard old moral codes, to mock the church's control over bodies. This wasn't just pleasure, it was politics. In a sense, every bed in Paris became a battlefield, and every lover's quarrel echoed with revolutionary zeal. By 1794, when Robespierre's reign of terror was at its peak, whispers spread that even he couldn't resist the lure of bedroom scandals. Of course, whether those rumors were true or just another propaganda pamphlet, we'll never know. But one thing is certain. While heads rolled in the streets, Paris pulsed with a different kind of revolution behind closed doors. If Paris was the beating heart of the revolution, then its bedrooms were the lungs, panting, gasping, and very often running out of air. Because by the mid-1790s, sex wasn't just pleasure, it was a statement. Let's start with prison romances. Revolutionary jails like the Conciergerie weren't just holding pens for the condemned, they were also matchmaking sites. Guards turned a blind eye, or demanded a bribe, as prisoners sought comfort in one another. There are records of makeshift marriages, hurried love affairs, and desperate rendezvous in dank corners. Picture Tinder dates where the bio reads, "Looking for someone to die with by Thursday." Grim? Yes. But in those final hours, intimacy was as much about defying fear as it was about desire. Then came the courtesans of the revolution, high-class escorts who had once entertained dukes and princes, now pivoted to new clients, merchants, soldiers, even politicians fresh off fiery speeches. Their salons weren't just for pillow talk, they were intelligence hubs, where secrets traded hands as often as caresses. One could argue these courtesans shaped the revolution more than any pamphlet. After all, pillow whispers often carried more weight than speeches at the National Assembly. And oh, the irony of Marat's bathtub. The radical journalist spent much of his later life confined to medicinal soaks for his skin disease. His bathroom became a strange blend of workspace and boudoir, where he received visitors, including women who adored him for his revolutionary zeal. Rumors suggested some of these visits blurred the line between consultation and flirtation. It's almost poetic that Marat met his end stabbed in that very bathtub, making his death look less like a martyrdom and more like a scandalous Roman fresco. Meanwhile, among the bourgeoisie, bedroom experimentation became a badge of modernity. Couples staged role plays of revolutionary figures. Yes, imagine your lover dressed up as Citizen Guillotine or Madame Liberty. These acts weren't just kinky play, They mocked the old aristocratic norms while celebrating their new identities. For once, equality really was in the bedroom. Of course, pamphleteers never missed a chance to scandalize. Satirical leaflets depicted politicians caught in orgies, nuns sneaking out from midnight encounters, and aristocrats engaging in unnatural acts. Most of it was pure propaganda, but the people devoured it like gossip rags at a hair salon. Paris lived on rumor, and if someone's reputation wasn't dragged through a sexual scandal, were they even a revolutionary? And speaking of nuns, let's talk about cloister scandals. As convents were dissolved, former nuns suddenly found themselves thrust into secular society. Some tried to live quietly, others leaned into their newfound freedom with abandon. Tales spread of ex-nuns becoming courtesans, hosting salons, or even preaching their own gospel of sensual liberation. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories fueled the image of revolution as a sexual as well as political upheaval. But the darkest irony came in how public execution fed private obsession. Some Parisians developed what we now call a fetish for guillotine martyrs. Women wrote love letters to condemned men, smuggled tokens of affection into prisons, and in some cases offered themselves to those awaiting death. Execution squares turned into macabre theaters where desire and death collided in ways both shocking and tragic. By the late 1790s, the revolution's radical sexual culture began to ebb. Conservatism crept back as Napoleon rose with visions of order and discipline. Yet for a decade, France had lived in a fevered dream where politics and passion danced hand in hand, and every whispered rumor in a boudoir could topple reputations or governments. By the late 1790s, Paris was exhausted, not just politically, but physically. After years of guillotines, pamphlets, and underground bedroom games, the revolution had left behind not just a new republic, but also a new sexual culture. Let's start with the aftermath of the aristocrats. Those who survived the blade tried desperately to rebuild their reputations. Imagine being a former duchess, stripped of your lands and known more for your boudoir than your bloodline. Many turned to discreet salons, where gossip replaced grandeur and flirtation became a form of survival. If Versailles had been about glittering chandeliers, the post-revolution salons were about flickering candlelight and whispered secrets. Meanwhile, commoners who once tasted liberation found the dream fading. That freewheeling erotic culture of the early revolution, the masquerades, the prison romances, the risque pamphlets, gave way to something more cautious. A sense of, "we've gone too far," seeped in. Husbands once proud of their wives' independence now longed for a return to modesty. Wives who had taken lovers in the name of liberty were suddenly branded immoral. The revolution had made sex a stage, but by the end, many just wanted the curtains to close. And into this fatigue marched Napoleon Bonaparte. He promised order, discipline, and above all, control. Under his shadow, sexuality became regimented once again. Marriage contracts tightened, censorship cut down on scandalous pamphlets, and the state reminded citizens that liberty might be revolutionary, but it was definitely not supposed to be orgasmic. Napoleon may have conquered Europe, but in bedrooms, he restored the old rules, ironically, undoing the very freedoms that had defined the revolution. Still, the decade had left scars and stories. Pamphleteers had written thousands of scandal sheets, some so outrageous they make modern tabloids look tame. Courtesans had shifted the balance of power with a well-timed whisper. Convents had become myths of fallen nuns discovering passion. And the guillotine, once an instrument of justice, had become, in its own twisted way, a symbol of forbidden desire. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: the revolution that promised to liberate bodies ended up making them more policed than ever. Yet in that brief, wild window, Paris lived like no other city in Europe. Sex was politics, politics was theater, and everyone, from peasants to princes, was caught in the same fevered drama. So next time you hear someone romanticize the French Revolution, remember, It wasn't just about storming the Bastille or drafting declarations. It was also about candlelit salons buzzing with rumors, prison cells echoing with hurried embraces, and pamphlets smearing reputations faster than Twitter ever could. In the end, the revolution proved one thing: kings may lose their heads, but human desire never does.